He dreamed of having a pool in his backyard and a quiet life in his new home, but one strike of the excavator changed everything. What was hidden underground had been kept secret by the city for decades. This discovery forced authorities to block the streets and launched an investigation that changed the fate of an entire neighborhood. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. The backyard had been the reason Marcus Hill bought the house. It was not the front porch with its modest white railing or the clean symmetry of the living room windows that faced the street, but the space behind the building, hidden from the road by a tall cedar fence, that convinced him this place could become a home in the truest sense of the word. The neighborhood lay in a wide, gentle valley on the outskirts of a Midwestern city, the kind of place real estate brochures love to describe as safe, friendly, and family-oriented. Streets were straight and quiet, lawns trimmed to the same height by different brands of lawnmowers, mailboxes standing at identical angles as if they had been measured with a ruler. In the evenings, the air carried the faint smell of charcoal and cut grass, and the only loud sound came from the distant whistle of freight trains crawling through the industrial district far beyond the rows of houses. Marcus had moved here after years of drifting between rental apartments, short-term jobs, and nights spent wondering whether stability was something other people were simply born into. He was 43, tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm manner that hid a long history of disappointment. Buying this house had been the hardest thing he had ever done. He had worked overtime for months, cut out every unnecessary expense, and filled out paperwork until he could recite his Social Security number in his sleep. When the keys finally rested in his palm, cold and metallic, he felt something he had not felt in decades, a sense that life was no longer a series of temporary arrangements. The backyard stretched farther than he expected. There was an old maple leaning slightly toward the fence, its bark split in places like old scars, and a narrow wooden deck attached to the back door where previous owners had left behind a rusted grill and a cracked plastic chair. The grass grew unevenly, thick and bright near the house, but sparse toward the far corner, where rainwater pooled after storms and refused to drain properly. That corner had always bothered him. No matter how much fertilizer he spread or how often he aerated the soil, the grass there never matched the rest of the yard. In spring, when everything else erupted in green, that patch remained dull and stubborn, as if it belonged to a different property altogether. He noticed other small peculiarities, though at first he paid them no real attention. Sometimes, after heavy rain, he would find tiny fragments of stone or dark hardened clumps in the muddy depression near the fence. They did not look like the gravel from his driveway, nor like the soil elsewhere in the yard. Once, while cleaning up after a storm, he picked up what he thought was a broken flower pot shard, but when he turned it in his fingers, he realized it was thicker and more irregular than any modern ceramic. He shrugged it off and tossed it into the trash, telling himself that old neighborhoods were full of buried junk. The dogs from next door were another odd detail. Their owners would let them roam freely when no one was watching, but the animals always stopped short of that same corner of Marcus's yard, barking at the fence line or circling wide around the low spot. He joked about it with the neighbors, suggesting the dogs were afraid of mud. Yet, even as he laughed, a faint discomfort settled in his chest. There was something about that patch of ground that resisted explanation. Still, the backyard was his refuge. After work, he would stand on the deck with a glass of iced tea, watching the sun slide behind the roofs of neighboring houses, imagining what the space could become. He pictured a rectangular pool set neatly into the earth, stone tiles surrounding it, a shaded seating area where friends and family could gather on summer evenings. It was not about luxury. It was about permanence. After so many years of living with cardboard boxes half unpacked, he wanted something rooted, something that would outlast him if it had to. By late spring, he had drawn rough plans and saved enough money to begin. He contacted the city, filed the necessary permits, and hired a small local contractor to handle the excavation. The paperwork felt like a ritual of legitimacy. Each stamp and signature made the project more real. The contractor visited the yard, measured the space with a tape, drove wooden stakes into the soil, and tied bright string between them, marking the outline of the future pool. When the men left, Marcus walked along the lines again and again, stepping over the taut strings, already visualizing the transformation. The neighbors watched with casual interest. Some nodded approvingly, others muttered about noise and construction dust, but most simply leaned against their fences and asked polite questions. He answered them all, telling the same story about starting fresh, about finally having a place worth improving. No one mentioned the low patch of ground. No one warned him about what lay beneath. On the first morning of excavation, the contractor's truck arrived just after 8, its engine growling as it reversed into the driveway. The men unloaded their tools, joked among themselves, and started stripping away the sod. The air filled with the smell of torn grass and diesel. Marcus stood on the deck, arms folded, feeling a strange mix of pride and nervousness. This was no longer a dream sketched on paper. The yard was changing before his eyes. As the topsoil peeled away, the contrast between the healthy grass near the house and the darker, heavier earth farther out became impossible to ignore. The men commented on it, poking at the dense mud with their shovels, but continued working. By midday, the rectangular outline had deepened into a real pit. Piles of soil rose along the fence, and the depression where water usually collected had been swallowed by the growing crater. Then, just as the afternoon sun reached its highest point, the excavator's bucket struck something solid. The sound was not the dull thud of stone, but a sharp metallic ring that cut through the hum of machinery. The operator froze, lifting the bucket slowly as if it might explode. Marcus felt the vibration through the wooden deck and straightened instinctively, his heart beating faster for reasons he could not yet name. They climbed down into the pit and brushed dirt away from the point of impact. Beneath the brown clay lay a curved surface coated in rust, its edge disappearing into the surrounding soil. For a moment, everyone stared in silence, uncertain whether they were looking at a forgotten septic tank or something else entirely. Marcus descended the ladder and knelt beside the object, running his fingers along the gritty metal. It was colder than the air above, as though it had been sealed away from the seasons. Around them, the piles of dirt were littered with things that had not been there before. More of the ceramic shards, darkened and thick, and small bits of iron that did not resemble modern hardware. Marcus picked one up and felt a prickle of unease crawl along his spine. The backyard he had known for a year, the patch of ground he had mowed and watered and walked across in bare feet, suddenly seemed foreign. As the men cleared more soil, a faint draft rose from a narrow gap where the metal curved downward. It carried a damp, earthy odor that did not belong in an open yard. The contractor suggested it was probably an old cistern or abandoned storage tank, something left behind before the subdivision was built. Yet his voice lacked conviction. The object was too deep, too carefully embedded for such a simple explanation. Marcus looked back at his house, at the clean lines of siding and the kitchen window where he could see his own reflection faintly in the glass. He had bought this place believing it to be an empty canvas, a piece of land with no memory. Standing at the edge of the pit, staring at the corroded metal and the dark soil that clung to it like a stain, he realized how little he truly knew about the ground beneath his feet. The project that was meant to mark the beginning of a quiet, settled life had already begun to unravel that certainty, and as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the yard, a sense took hold of him that whatever lay below was not finished with him yet. The moment the excavator's bucket rang against the buried object, the mood of the backyard shifted in a way Marcus could feel in his bones. What had begun as a routine construction project now hung suspended in uncertainty, as if the earth itself had raised a hand and demanded attention. The contractor climbed down into the pit with a flashlight and a trowel, scraping carefully at the rusted surface, while the others leaned over the edge, shading their eyes from the glare of the sun. The metal was not flat like a tank wall or jagged like discarded scrap. It curved gently, forming a rounded dome whose edges disappeared into compacted clay. There were faint lines where seams might once have been welded or bolted together, now softened by decades of corrosion. Marcus stood beside them, his boots sinking slightly into the churned soil. The smell rising from the hole was stronger than before, a mix of wet stone and something vaguely sweet, like decaying leaves sealed away from air. He remembered the fragments he had tossed into the trash weeks earlier and wondered how many clues he had unknowingly discarded. When he picked up one of the newly unearthed shards, it left a brown stain on his fingertips. It was thick, uneven, and darkened in a way that suggested great age, not the accidental breakage of a flower pot from a forgotten garden party. The men began to clear more dirt by hand, widening the exposed section of metal. Their shovels scraped against it with muted taps that echoed inside the pit. With each stroke, more of the dome emerged, and it became clear that it was not a standalone piece but part of a larger structure buried deep below the yard. Someone suggested it might be the lid of an old industrial tank, but no one could explain why such a thing would be placed in a residential neighborhood, or why it would be sealed so far beneath the surface. As the soil was pulled away, more objects appeared in the spoil piles. Rusted nails that were thicker than any modern framing hardware, bent into strange shapes. Slivers of metal that looked like fragments of buckles or clasps, and scattered among them, dark clumps that fell apart into fibrous strands when touched, leaving behind a faint, unpleasant odor. One of the workers recoiled, muttering that it smelled like a flooded basement from 100 years ago. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. This was not debris left behind by careless builders. It was a layer of history, disturbed for the first time in generations. The contractor finally ordered the machinery shut down. The excavator fell silent, and the sudden absence of noise made the backyard feel cavernous and exposed. Without the rumble of engines, Marcus could hear the distant traffic on the main road, the buzz of cicadas in the trees, the hum of air conditioners from neighboring houses. All of it seemed too normal for the scene unfolding in the pit. They decided to probe the metal by hand, using a pry bar to test its resistance. When the bar slipped into a narrow gap at the edge of the dome, it did not stop. It slid downward into empty space, and a whisper of cool air drifted up from below. The men exchanged looks that were no longer curious, but uneasy. One of them leaned closer and shone his flashlight into the gap, but the beam vanished almost immediately, swallowed by darkness. The idea that there was hollow space beneath his yard unsettled Marcus more than he could have anticipated. He imagined the neat rectangle of his house perched over a void, supported by soil that might never have been as solid as he believed. Memories of the low patch that never grew grass and the dogs that refused to cross it returned with a sharp clarity. This had been here all along, silently shaping the surface without anyone noticing. They widened the opening just enough to peer inside. The smell intensified, cold and stale, like air released from a sealed cellar. The contractor suggested it might be dangerous to continue without proper equipment. There could be trapped gases, unstable walls, any number of hazards invisible to the eye. Marcus nodded, relief mingling with dread. He wanted answers, but he did not want them bought at the cost of someone's life. While they waited for instructions, the men began sorting through the dirt they had already removed. They laid the fragments out on a piece of plywood, arranging them instinctively as if trying to assemble a broken puzzle. Marcus watched them handle the pottery shards with growing care, as though they had crossed an invisible line from construction into something else entirely. One of the workers pointed out the pattern etched faintly into a curved piece, a design too deliberate to be random. Another held up a rusted nail and remarked that it had been forged by hand, not stamped by a machine. The contractor finally made the call to halt all work. He explained that the discovery had legal and safety implications, and that specialists would need to be brought in before anything more could be done. Marcus agreed without hesitation. His initial excitement about the pool had been replaced by a heavy awareness that the ground beneath his home was no longer simply his to reshape. As the men packed up their tools, neighbors began to gather at the fence, drawn by the silence where noise had been all day. They asked questions, craning their necks to see the hole, but the workers could offer little more than vague descriptions. Marcus stood among them, feeling both responsible and powerless. This was his yard, his project, yet it was already slipping beyond his control. That evening, long after the trucks had driven away, he returned to the pit alone. The setting sun cast long shadows across the disturbed earth, making the exposed metal gleam dully at the bottom, like the back of some buried creature. He crouched at the edge and stared into the narrow opening they had created. The darkness beyond seemed thicker than ordinary shadow, as if it were absorbing the light rather than merely lacking it. He wondered how long the structure had been there, how many families had lived above it unaware, how many summers children had played on that patch of ground without ever knowing what lay beneath their feet. The backyard he had thought of as a blank space waiting for his dreams was revealing itself as something layered and complex, shaped by decisions and events far removed from his own life. By the time he went back inside, the air had cooled and the neighborhood had settled into its evening routine. Yet Marcus could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The metallic strike of the excavator had not just interrupted a construction project, it had pierced the surface of the present and opened a narrow window into a buried past, one that was already beginning to exert its pull on everything above it. Marcus barely slept that night. The quiet that had always soothed him now felt hollow, as though the house were balanced on something fragile and unseen. He lay awake, listening to the faint settling sounds of the structure, the soft tick of cooling pipes, the distant bark of a dog, and, beneath all of it, the imagined echo of that metallic dome waiting in the dark soil behind his bedroom wall. When dawn finally arrived, it did not bring relief. Instead, it carried a sharp clarity, the kind that follows a long night of restless thought. By mid-morning, the specialists had arrived. 2 white vans pulled into the driveway bearing the logos of a local engineering firm and a geotechnical survey company. Men and women stepped out carrying cases that held instruments Marcus had only ever seen on television. Slender antennae, handheld consoles, tripods that folded out like skeletal limbs. They moved with professional detachment, their attention fixed on the disturbed yard rather than the house or its owner. Marcus felt like a bystander in his own life, standing on the deck while others took control of the space he had believed was his sanctuary. The first step was to compare what they had found with the city's records. They unfolded yellowed maps and digital plans on the hood of one of the vans, scrolling through the layers of infrastructure that showed water lines, sewer pipes, electrical conduits. None of them marked anything in the location of the metal dome. One of the engineers frowned and zoomed in further, shaking his head slightly. According to the paperwork, the land had been clean when the subdivision was built. Whatever lay beneath Marcus's backyard had never been documented. They cordoned off the pit with bright tape and positioned their ground-penetrating radar units at the edges of the marked pool area. The machines glided slowly over the grass and exposed soil, emitting soft beeps as they recorded invisible reflections from below. Marcus watched the operators' faces, searching for reactions, but their expressions remained neutral, focused. It was only when the first data appeared on their screens that the atmosphere changed. The console displayed a series of horizontal bands and irregular shapes, pale against a darker background. To Marcus, it looked like an abstract painting, but the woman operating the device pointed at the display and began to explain in measured terms that this indicated voids and dense objects beneath the surface. As she moved the scanner back and forth, the pattern repeated itself, not just beneath the pit, but extending outward, beyond the lines of the stakes, and into areas of the yard that had not been disturbed. They expanded the scan, moving closer to the fence, then beyond it, asking permission to briefly cross into the neighbor's yard. The shapes on the screen multiplied, forming a network that defied simple explanation. There were linear segments that suggested corridors or trenches, and clusters of anomalies arranged with an unsettling regularity. Whatever this was, it was not confined to Marcus's property. It ran beneath the surrounding homes like a hidden skeleton. When the team gathered to review the data, their voices were low and serious. The lead engineer traced the patterns with his finger, murmuring about scale and depth. He estimated that some of the voids lay far deeper than any residential utility would be placed. The suggestion that this could be an old industrial site faded quickly. There were too many repeated forms, too much organization. The contractor who had started the project arrived to see what had become of his halted job. He stood beside Marcus, staring at the glowing screens, and let out a long breath. He had seen buried tanks and forgotten foundations before, but never anything like this. The implication that the entire block might be sitting on top of something unknown left him visibly shaken. Marcus felt a cold weight settle in his chest. The backyard that had once represented his future now appeared on a screen as a dense, layered map of the past. The specialists explained that further excavation was out of the question without formal approval. There were safety concerns, possible collapse risks, and the potential presence of hazardous gases in the voids. The pit was to be secured, the area restricted until a full assessment could be conducted. They photographed the pottery shards and metal fragments that had been laid out on the plywood and placed each piece into labeled evidence bags. Marcus watched as the remnants of whatever history lay beneath his yard were reduced to catalog numbers. One of the specialists held a shard up to the light and tilted it, revealing a faint pattern etched into its surface. She did not elaborate, but the look she exchanged with her colleague told Marcus that this was not a recent artifact. As word spread among the neighbors that the discovery extended beyond one backyard, the street began to feel crowded. People emerged from their houses, gathering in small clusters behind the tape, whispering to one another. Some speculated about tunnels or forgotten bunkers, others about criminal activity hidden away long ago. Phones were raised, pictures taken. Marcus felt exposed, his private world suddenly open to public curiosity. The team leader called him aside to explain the next steps. They would be contacting the city's historical department and a group of archaeologists to evaluate the findings. The possibility that this was a site of cultural or historical significance could not be ignored. Until then, the yard was effectively off limits. Marcus nodded, trying to absorb the implications. He asked how long the process might take, and the answer was honest but vague. It could be days, weeks, longer if the scope of the site was as large as the scans suggested. That afternoon, as the specialists packed up their equipment, the quiet of the street felt strained rather than peaceful. Marcus returned to the edge of the pit, gazing at the rusted dome and the dark opening beside it. The cold air still drifted upward, as steady as a breath. He wondered how many more such openings lay hidden beneath neighboring lawns, under children's swing sets and vegetable gardens, under patios where people laughed and drank, and never imagined the ground might be hollow. By evening, the city had erected a temporary fence around his yard, replacing the bright tape with metal panels that clanked as they were bolted together. The barrier felt like a boundary, not just of space, but of authority. Marcus could no longer step freely into the place that had defined his vision of home. He stood on the deck and watched the sun sink behind the rooftops, feeling as though the earth itself had shifted beneath him, carrying with it the certainty he had worked so hard to build. The metal fencing that appeared around Marcus Hill's backyard the following morning changed the street more effectively than any headline ever could. The familiar view of trimmed hedges and matching mailboxes was now broken by rigid gray panels that reflected the sunlight like a warning. Police cruisers idled at the corner, their engines humming quietly, and city vehicles lined the curb as though a film crew had descended without permission. Neighbors stood in their driveways holding coffee mugs that had gone cold, staring at the scene with expressions that hovered between curiosity and unease. Marcus had been awake since dawn, pacing between the living room and the kitchen window. Every time he glanced outside, he half expected the fence to have vanished, for the pit in his backyard to have been smoothed over as if it were all a dream. Instead, the reality pressed in harder with each passing minute. A uniformed officer knocked on his door to inform him that the city was treating the site as a potential hazard area, and that access would be restricted until further notice. The words were delivered politely, but they carried the weight of authority that Marcus had never encountered so directly in his own home. Soon afterward, a group of officials arrived, including representatives from the historical department and emergency services. They set up a folding table near the curb and began consulting maps and digital tablets. The lead archaeologist, a gray-haired man with a calm but intent demeanor, was shown the fragments that had been recovered. He examined them with gloved hands, turning each piece slowly, his eyes narrowing as he traced patterns barely visible beneath the grime. Marcus watched him closely, trying to read his face, but whatever recognition dawned there was carefully contained. Within hours, a notice was distributed to the immediate neighbors explaining that the area might require temporary evacuation due to safety concerns. The word evacuation sent a ripple of panic through the street. People began packing small bags, ushering children inside, making hurried phone calls to relatives. Some were angry, others frightened, and many were both. The sense of shared routine that had defined the neighborhood dissolved into a flurry of personal crises. Marcus found himself in the strange position of being both the cause of the disruption and as powerless as anyone else affected by it. He was advised to prepare for the possibility that he might not be allowed to remain in his home while further assessments were conducted. The thought of leaving, of handing his keys back to the city even temporarily, struck him harder than he expected. He had fought so long to own a place of his own, and now that place was slipping through his fingers for reasons that had nothing to do with his actions. As the day wore on, reporters arrived. Cameras appeared behind the police tape, and microphones were thrust toward any neighbor willing to speak. Marcus avoided them, retreating into his house whenever a stranger glanced his way. He could hear snippets of conversation through the open windows, speculation about underground tunnels, hidden bunkers, even criminal activity. None of it came close to the truth, but the sheer volume of theories added to the sense that the neighborhood was no longer a private space, but a public spectacle. By mid-afternoon, a small team of archaeologists had been granted limited access to the pit. They moved with deliberate caution, documenting the exposed metal and the surrounding soil without disturbing anything further. One of them knelt at the edge of the opening, shining a flashlight into the void, and after a moment, straightened with a look that sent a chill through Marcus. The archaeologist said nothing aloud, but he spoke quietly to the others, and the group withdrew a short time later. The announcement came soon after. The city was officially classifying the site as a potential historical discovery and suspending all construction in the area. The words were read from a prepared statement by a city official whose calm tone contrasted starkly with the tension rippling through the crowd. He did not specify what they believed lay beneath the houses, only that preliminary evidence suggested it was not a simple abandoned structure. That evening, the street was eerily quiet. Many families had left to stay with relatives or in hotels arranged by the city. Others remained, their lights glowing behind closed curtains as if trying to pretend nothing had changed. Marcus sat alone in his living room, the television muted, watching the reflection of police lights flicker across his walls. He thought about the backyard as it had been only days before, the uneven grass, the low spot that never quite dried. It felt like a different lifetime. The next morning brought the first clear hint of the truth. The lead archaeologist requested a private meeting with Marcus. They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Marcus had once spread out his pool plans. The man explained in careful terms that the fragments recovered from the soil bore characteristics of a burial context. The patterns on the pottery were consistent with those used in ceremonial items from the early 20th century, and the density of anomalies on the radar scans suggested not a single grave, but many. Marcus listened in stunned silence. The idea that his backyard might contain human remains was almost too much to comprehend. He asked how such a thing could go unnoticed for so long. The archaeologist answered honestly that it should not have. Records indicated that the land had been flagged as sensitive decades earlier, but that information had been lost or deliberately ignored as the area was developed. The phrase "probable mass burial" was not used in the official statements, but it was whispered among the professionals, and it made its way into the neighborhood like a contagion. When Marcus stepped outside later that day, he saw fear etched into the faces of those who had stayed behind. People avoided his gaze, not out of blame, but out of a shared sense of violation. Their perfect suburb had been built on something dark, and now that darkness was seeping into the light. As night fell, the fence around Marcus's yard seemed to loom higher than before. It was no longer just a barrier around a construction site. It was a line drawn between what the neighborhood had been and what it was becoming. Marcus stood at his back door, unable to step beyond the threshold, aware that the ground he had walked on so casually might soon be recognized as sacred or forbidden. The quiet backyard that had once promised him peace had become the epicenter of a truth too heavy for anyone to ignore. The words spoken in Marcus's kitchen did not leave him when the archaeologist walked out. They lingered in the air like a scent that refused to fade, altering the meaning of every object he saw. The dining table was no longer just a place where he ate alone after work. The floor beneath it no longer felt solid. He moved through the rooms as though he were a guest in someone else's house, stepping carefully, afraid that the slightest sound might echo into the darkness under his yard. Over the following days, the presence of the historical teams became permanent. White tents were erected beyond the fence, shielding the pit from the curious eyes of the media and the neighborhood. Trucks marked with the seals of state agencies arrived in steady succession, carrying equipment designed not for construction, but for careful recovery. The language spoken outside his windows changed. Words like depth and strata were replaced by context and provenance. The backyard was no longer referred to as a site, but as a location of interest. Marcus was allowed to observe from a distance, escorted by a city liaison whose job was to make sure he stayed out of restricted zones. He stood at the edge of the temporary walkway they had laid down and watched the archaeologists kneel in the soil where his future pool had once been marked out with string. They worked slowly, brushing away layers of earth with tools that looked better suited for art restoration than excavation. The rusted dome was no longer the center of attention. The focus had shifted to what lay around it, the subtle changes in soil color, the faint outlines that suggested deliberate placement rather than random dumping. What they uncovered confirmed the archaeologists' earlier suspicions. Beneath the churned clay were shapes that spoke of human intervention. The soil was darker in narrow ovals, arranged not haphazardly, but with a quiet order that was impossible to mistake once it had been pointed out. Each one told the same silent story. Something had been placed here with care, covered, and then hidden beneath years of accumulated earth. The pottery fragments began to make sense in this new context. They were no longer curiosities, but parts of something larger, objects meant to accompany the dead. One of the researchers explained to Marcus that the designs etched into the clay were not decorative in the way modern ceramics were. They were symbolic, marking identity and belief, hinting at rituals that had been practiced long before the houses on his street were even imagined. The discovery drew people from beyond the neighborhood. Historians arrived from universities in other states, as did representatives from cultural organizations who had spent years searching for answers about missing communities. They pored over the fragments, photographed the soil layers, and cross-referenced the emerging picture with faded maps and forgotten documents. Marcus listened as they spoke about the early 20th century, about a period when entire groups of people had lived on the margins of society, their deaths unrecorded, their burials hidden away to avoid attention. In the evenings, when the street was quiet and the teams had packed up for the day, Marcus would sit alone on his couch, scrolling through scanned copies of old city records that had been made public in the wake of the discovery. He found references to land parcels that had never been developed, to zoning exceptions granted without explanation, to properties sold at suspiciously low prices. It was as though a shadow history of the city was emerging, one that had been present all along, but never allowed into the light. One document in particular haunted him. It was a brief memo dated decades before he was born, written by a municipal clerk whose name no longer appeared in any current records. The memo mentioned concerns about disturbances on a piece of land that matched the coordinates of his neighborhood. It advised caution, suggested that further investigation was necessary. The recommendation had been filed away, never acted upon, buried as effectively as the graves beneath his yard. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on Marcus with a force he had never felt before. He had come here to start over, to build something lasting for himself, but instead he had become the accidental custodian of a tragedy that had been silenced for generations. The thought that families had been erased, their loved ones hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and neglect, filled him with a mix of anger and sorrow he struggled to articulate. As news of the findings spread, members of the wider community began to arrive at the perimeter fence. Some carried flowers, others photographs of ancestors whose disappearances had never been explained. They stood quietly, often in small groups, speaking in low voices or not at all. Marcus watched them from his porch, feeling both connected to and separated from their grief. This was his backyard, yet the story it was telling belonged to far more people than just him. The official language surrounding the site became more careful as the evidence mounted. City statements spoke of a historical burial complex, of a place that would require sensitive handling. But in the private conversations Marcus overheard, the truth was clearer. This was not a forgotten cemetery marked by time and neglect. It was a clandestine site, a place chosen precisely because it was hidden, because it lay outside the view of those who might have asked uncomfortable questions. The past was no longer an abstract concept. It was visible in the soil, tangible in the artifacts that emerged day by day. Marcus learned to recognize the signs of careful burial, the way the earth settled differently over a body than over empty ground. He learned that the absence of markers was itself a marker, an indication that whoever had arranged these graves had wanted them to vanish from memory. At night, he dreamed of the low patch in his yard as it had been before the excavation. In his dreams, it was not barren but crowded, filled with figures he could not see clearly, their presence announced only by the way the grass refused to grow. He would wake with the uneasy sense that the land had been trying to speak to him all along, that his decision to dig had simply given it a voice. The archaeologists confirmed their conclusions at the end of the week. In a closed meeting with city officials and a handful of community representatives, they stated that the site likely contained a large number of unmarked graves dating back over a century. The arrangement, the artifacts, and the depth of the layers all pointed to a systematic practice rather than isolated incidents. It was, in the measured language of their report, a burial complex associated with marginalized populations whose deaths had never been formally recorded. When Marcus heard this, he felt the last remnants of his old expectations dissolve. The backyard was no longer a place where he could imagine summer evenings by a pool. It had become a doorway into a chapter of history his city had tried to forget. The fence, the tents, the silent figures working in the soil were all manifestations of that shift, visible reminders that the ground beneath ordinary lives could carry extraordinary truths. As the sun set over the neighborhood that evening, the lights inside the tents glowed softly, illuminating the careful work taking place within. Marcus stood at his window and watched until the last researcher left for the night. Only then did he allow himself to turn away, carrying with him the knowledge that his quiet suburban street had been built over a story that refused to remain buried any longer. The backyard had become a forbidden landscape, a place Marcus could see but no longer touch. The quiet hum of activity behind the fence was now as familiar to him as the sound of his own refrigerator, Yet it never lost its power to unsettle him. Each day he woke to the knowledge that the soil beneath his home was being peeled back layer by layer, exposing not just bones and broken objects, but a pattern of decisions that had allowed all of it to be hidden for so long. It was a reporter who first hinted to Marcus that the story was no longer only about forgotten graves. She had tracked him down outside a grocery store, introducing herself with an apologetic smile, before asking whether he was aware that several former landowners had sold their parcels at steep discounts shortly before the subdivision was built. Marcus had not known this. The houses on his street had all been marketed as part of a standard development. Nothing unusual, nothing to suggest that the land had ever been considered problematic. Yet the reporter spoke of deeds that changed hands quickly, of shell companies that appeared briefly in the records and then vanished. Curiosity hardened into determination. Marcus began to request documents from the city, filing formal information requests that returned scanned pages of contracts and memoranda. It was tedious work, combing through legal language and faded signatures, but patterns soon emerged. The land beneath his home and those around it had been bought cheaply decades earlier, often from families who seemed to have inherited little more than confusion about the property's history. In several cases, there were addenda to the sales that mentioned responsibilities related to site assessment or environmental review. Those responsibilities, however, never seemed to have been fulfilled. One evening, a man named Leonard Price called him. Leonard had been a junior employee at a real estate firm during the period when the land was being assembled for development. He spoke cautiously, as though unsure how much he should reveal, but his story filled in the gaps left by the paperwork. There had been concerns back then, Leonard said, whispers about something under the ground that made the land hard to sell. Executives had dismissed them as rumors, yet they had also insisted on unusually strict confidentiality clauses. The goal, Leonard admitted, had been to push the project through before anyone could demand a deeper investigation. Marcus felt a bitter mix of vindication and betrayal as he listened. The graves beneath his yard had not simply been forgotten. They had been inconvenient. And in the calculus of profit and deadlines, inconvenience had been treated as something that could be paved over. The city launched its own inquiry soon after the reporter's article ran. Officials who had once spoken only in generalities now found themselves under scrutiny. Public records requests were mirrored by subpoenas, and the names of former council members and developers began to surface in the evening news. Marcus watched from his living room as footage of men in suits entering courthouse buildings played across the screen, their expressions carefully blank. The pressure did not come solely from outside. Within the neighborhood, tensions mounted. Some residents were angry at Marcus, irrationally blaming him for what was happening. They argued that if he had not decided to dig, none of this would have come to light, that their property values would not be plummeting, that their lives would not be upended. Others defended him fiercely, insisting that the truth mattered more than market prices. The street that had once been defined by polite nods and casual greetings was now a place of whispered arguments and closed doors. In the midst of this, Marcus received an offer. A representative of the development company that had built the subdivision requested a private meeting. They sat across from him in a rented office downtown, speaking in smooth, practiced tones about inconvenience and misunderstanding. They suggested a settlement that would compensate him generously for the disruption to his life, a figure large enough to buy another house outright in a different part of the city. All he had to do, they implied, was agree to a non-disclosure arrangement and allow the legal process to unfold without his involvement. Marcus stared at the polished table between them and imagined the backyard as it had been, the low patch of ground that never quite dried. He thought about the families now, standing behind the fence holding photographs of people whose names had vanished from official history. The money being offered could solve his immediate problems, but it would also silence him. He declined the offer, his voice steady in a way that surprised even him. The refusal marked a turning point. Marcus found himself drawn deeper into the investigation, providing interviews, sharing documents, attending meetings with city officials and community leaders. He learned more about zoning laws and historical preservation statutes than he had ever wanted to know. Each new piece of information added weight to the realization that this was not a simple case of negligence. It was a system that had allowed inconvenient truths to be buried beneath layers of paperwork and asphalt. The personal cost was real. His house was formally assessed as part of the investigation, engineers testing its foundation for stability given the voids beneath the neighborhood. For weeks, he did not know whether he would be allowed to return permanently or whether the city would declare the area unsafe. He lived out of boxes in a small apartment provided by a relocation program, his routines reduced to the essentials. The sense of home he had fought so hard to establish felt distant, like a photograph of someone else's life. Yet there were moments of unexpected solidarity. Members of the community, whose ancestors were believed to be among the buried, reached out to him, thanking him for standing firm. They shared stories of grandparents who had disappeared without explanation, of questions that had haunted families for generations. Marcus listened, humbled by the realization that his decision to dig a pool had intersected with histories far larger than his own. As the investigation progressed, the narrative shifted from discovery to accountability. Evidence emerged that the developers had been informed of the site's sensitivity before construction began, that a previous landowner had disclosed concerns in exchange for a reduced sale price, with the understanding that proper archaeological work would be funded. That work had never been done. Instead, the land had been leveled and built over, the warnings filed away and forgotten. The phrase "traces of collusion" began appearing in official documents, and with it the acknowledgement that what lay beneath Marcus's yard was not just a remnant of the past, but the product of deliberate choices in the present. Standing in his temporary apartment one evening, surrounded by the cardboard boxes that held the fragments of his disrupted life, Marcus realized that the story had outgrown the boundaries of his backyard. It was now a reckoning with the way a city had chosen to remember and to forget, and he was no longer simply the man who had struck metal in his yard. He was a witness, and there was no turning back. The hearings began in early autumn when the leaves along Marcus Hill's street turned brittle and the air sharpened with the promise of winter. By then, the backyard he once imagined filling with water and laughter had been transformed into something unrecognizable. A field of canvas tents and wooden walkways, floodlights standing where lawn chairs used to be. What had started as a single pit had expanded into a carefully mapped grid that extended across several properties, its boundaries marked by stakes and measuring tape, like the outline of a forgotten city slowly rising from the ground. The official declaration came in a room that smelled faintly of coffee and dust, in the presence of city council members, representatives of historical and cultural organizations, and a scattering of residents who had chosen to stay, despite the uncertainty. The land beneath the subdivision, they announced, was to be recognized as a protected historical site. It would be preserved in its entirety, studied with the full resources of the state, and ultimately transformed into a memorial space dedicated to those whose lives had been hidden beneath layers of neglect and indifference. Marcus listened as though from a distance. The words should have felt triumphant, but they were heavy instead, weighted with the reality that nothing in his life would ever be quite the same. The decision meant that the neighborhood could not be restored to its previous form. Houses would be purchased by the city, families relocated, the grid of streets slowly erased in favor of a landscape that acknowledged the truth beneath it. In the weeks that followed, the process unfolded with bureaucratic precision. Inspectors evaluated each home, including Marcus's, determining which could be salvaged and which would have to be removed to ensure the integrity of the site. The relocation program offered fair compensation, but no amount of money could replace the sense of belonging that had been taken from those who had invested not just savings, but identity into their homes. Marcus moved back into his house for a brief period, long enough to sort through what he would keep and what he would leave behind. Each room seemed smaller now, not because the walls had moved, but because the meaning of the place had changed. The archaeological work intensified. Teams from universities arrived with specialized equipment, their focus no longer limited to confirming the existence of graves, but expanding to the delicate task of recovery and identification. The careful rhythm of their work became part of the neighborhood's daily life. Brush, photograph, document, repeat. The aim was not only to uncover, but to restore dignity, to ensure that each individual whose remains lay in the soil would be treated with the respect denied to them in life. Community members gathered regularly at the edge of the site. Some brought food for the workers, others simply stood in silence. Temporary signs appeared along the fence, bearing names, dates, fragments of family histories that had finally found a place to be spoken aloud. The backyard that had once been Marcus's private refuge had become a shared space of mourning and recognition. The developers did not escape unscathed. Court proceedings advanced steadily, revealing in open session the paper trail that had allowed the land to be built over in the first place. Emails were read aloud, contracts projected onto screens, their euphemistic language stripped of any pretense of innocence. The former owner of the land testified that he had disclosed the site's significance decades earlier, that he had accepted a reduced price in exchange for assurances that the proper work would be done. Those assurances had been ignored, replaced by a strategy of speed and silence. Marcus was called to speak as well. He described the low patch of grass that never grew, the dogs that would not cross it, the fragments he had once mistaken for trash. His words were simple, unembellished, yet they carried the weight of someone who had lived unknowingly on top of history. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that comes not from awkwardness, but from shared understanding. As winter approached, the neighborhood emptied. Move-in trucks replaced news vans, carrying away the furniture and memories of families who had once believed they would grow old on those streets. Houses were boarded up, then carefully dismantled, their materials sorted and removed so as not to disturb the ground beneath. Marcus watched his own home undergo the same fate, standing across the street as the walls came down piece by piece. He felt the loss keenly, yet he also felt a strange release, as though the structure had been a shell for something that was no longer there. The Memorial Planning Committee invited him to participate, recognizing that his accidental discovery had been the catalyst for everything that followed. He attended meetings in municipal buildings and community centers, listening as architects and cultural leaders debated how best to honor those who had been hidden for so long. The designs favored simplicity, open space, pathways that followed the original contours of the land, rather than imposing new ones. The idea was to let the earth itself guide visitors, to create a place where silence would speak louder than any inscription. On the first anniversary of the discovery, a small ceremony was held at the site. The tents were still there, the work far from complete, but a section of ground had been cleared and leveled, and people gathered in a wide circle. There were no speeches, only the soft murmur of wind through bare trees and the distant hum of traffic from the city that continued to move forward even as it reckoned with its past. Marcus stood at the edge of the circle, hands in his coat pockets, feeling the cold seep up through the soles of his shoes. He thought of the backyard as it had been when he first unlocked the door to the house, of the dreams he had poured into that uneven patch of grass. Those dreams had been buried beneath something far more important, a truth that had waited patiently for someone to listen. As he turned to leave, he took one last look at the ground, now marked not by stakes or fences, but by the quiet attention of those determined to remember. The earth had spoken at last, and in doing so it had changed him. His life was no longer defined by the loss of a home or the abandonment of a project. It was defined by his role in restoring names to the nameless, in acknowledging that beneath the most ordinary places lay stories that demanded to be heard. If this story shocked you, make sure you subscribe right now so you don't miss what happens next. There are many more investigations and hidden truths waiting for you in our upcoming videos. Share this video with your friends and family, because the next discovery could be even closer to home than you think.